Hi guys, today we're going to talk a little bit more about rudimental history, but in this case, instead of focusing on a single rudiment and its name or its sticking or whatever, we're going to talk about a guy, George Bruce Barrett. George Barrett Bruce. I actually don't know what his name really was. I think it was Bruce Barrett, but that's sort of the point of the video, is that it's really unclear. So this guy is famous for writing the Drummers and Fifers guide with Daniel Decatur Emmett, whose name I'm fairly certain of. And they wrote this book in 1862, and it was during the Civil War. It was one of the more popular and influential American rudimental drum manuals to ever come out. It was really highly regarded by Sanford Moeller of the Moeller Stroke, and in Moeller's Art of Drumming, he praises Bruce and Emmett, and he actually says that they saved American drumming. Saved it from what, I don't know, but he was a really big fan of them, and you can see his influence come up in the rudiments and style of Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich, just to name a few guys. So this guy's kind of crazy though, and we're going to get into that. A lot of people take their biography of George from the cover of the book, the Drummers and Fifers Guide, and on the cover it says that his name was George Barrett Bruce, and that he served in the 7th Regiment of the New York State Militia, and that he was the principal drum instructor on Bedloes Island and at the U.S. Army Eastern School of Practice on Governor's Island. And so this sounds pretty impressive, and a lot of people just leave it at that. But I don't think leaving it at that is the whole story. So despite all the questions I'm going to bring up about his biography, I think he really was a pretty good drummer. He and Dan Emmett did invent the flamacue, although they called it the flamamacue with an extra ma in there. And their book was pretty good. People still use it today for reenactment of the Civil War. I think there are a couple weird things in there, but every book has its own weird things. So that's not unusual for the time period. And so the guy kept getting jobs as a drummer and a drum major, so I think he did know what he was talking about. He was just a little sketch. For example, one of the claims on the book cover is that he was the principal drum instructor on Bedloes Island. But Bedloes Island was the home of Fort Wood during the Civil War. It's now known as Liberty Island, where the Statue of Liberty is in New York Harbor. And Fort Wood was an ordnance depot in the Civil War, not a musician's training facility. So there really was no principal drum instructor, and so, of course, it wasn't George. He also says he was the principal drum instructor at Governor's Island, where the U.S. Army Eastern School of Practice was located. There was a music school there for the Army, but he was not the instructor. We actually know that the instructors were Michael Moore and Sergeant Hankey, and they were assisted by Corporal Butler and Corporal Fafey, and so none of those guys is George. So that's just straight up not true either. In fact, the Hankey Moore manuscript is a thing that we have and we can look at, and so we know not only that Hankey and Moore were the music instructors, we know exactly what music they were teaching. None of it ever mentions George Bruce or George Barrett. So the last thing that he claims on the cover is that he served in the 7th Regiment of the New York State Militia, which I think is actually true. And the reason I think it's true is because you can find a list of the guys who were in that regiment, and one of them is George B. Barrett, which is not the same as George Barrett Bruce, but if you assume that the B stands for Bruce, it's probably the same guy. And this is the first piece of information that I saw where I was like, wait a second. That's not quite right, but it's real close. It's awkwardly close. You can't, it'd be hard to just make that up and have it be true. And there's actually a picture of him from the 7th Regiment here. And I don't know of any other pictures of him, so I can't compare, but I really do think this is the same guy. And it's possible that it's not, that it's a coincidence of initials, and I'm just sort of reading too much into it. However, there was a guy named George Barrett who was born in 1816 in Baltimore, Maryland, and he's the same age that George Barrett Bruce should be. And if we look at the career of Bruce Barrett and Barrett Bruce, we don't see any overlaps or directly contradicting information where he would have to be in two places at once for this to work out, which is a pretty good indicator that he was only in one place at once. Same guy. So if we start out assuming this is the same guy, he was born George Bruce Barrett in 1816, like I said, and he learned to drum from a guy named Drum Major Riggs. I don't know when or where. And in 1836, he enlisted in the 2nd Maryland Dragoons under the name George Barrett. He deserted this post in 1837, and of course this is a big deal in the military to desert, so he had a problem, which was probably the first time he really thought about changing his name, because he needed to get away from this sort of disreputable act. So he went by George Bruce, and he actually ended up re-enlisting in the Maryland Dragoons in 1839, I think. And he served for 4 years, and sometime in 1843, they actually figured it out, I think, because they abruptly discharged him. It doesn't exactly say it's because they figured it out, but one can assume that if they suddenly realized that George Bruce was the same guy as George Barrett, and he had deserted before, that they would do something, and in this case, I think it was just kick him out. So after he was kicked out of the Dragoons, and sometime before the outbreak of the Civil War, he actually signed up as a drummer under the name George Bruce in the 69th New York Regiment of Fighting Irish, and he served for some undisclosed period of time. I've not been able to figure that out. But then the Civil War does break out, and he actually signs up as a corporal in the 7th Regiment of the New York State Militia under the name George Barrett. So he goes back to his original birth name in the Civil War for the 7th. And this is the post he lists on his book cover. Now, he then goes on to write the Drummers and Fifers Guide with Dan Emmett in 1862. So, of course, I would assume that the 7th Regiment post was sometime in 1861. So after the publication of the book in 1863, he actually gets a drum major position under the name George Bruce in the 22nd Regiment of the New York State Militia. And I think he had to use the name Bruce because that's the name he put on the book. And the book is, with its sort of probably made-up qualifications, is likely why he was able to get a drum major position instead of just being a regular drummer. So at this point, he's already gone as Barrett, and then Bruce again, and then Barrett again, and then back to Bruce, and then Bruce again. But we're not done yet. He actually gets a position later in the war with the 5th Infantry Regiment in Maryland under the name George Bruce Barrett. So he goes back once again to Barrett. And I only know about this post from an 1871 article in a military publication that was written well after the 5th had been disbanded after the war was over. And in that publication, they list him as the drum major for the 5th, and he is noted as being the author of the Drummers and Fifers Guide, which is kind of interesting because they use the Barrett name and they associate him with the book that he published under the Bruce name. So at some point, someone somewhere must have realized that this was the same guy. It had to have been common knowledge at the time to at least some people that George Bruce Barrett and George Barrett Bruce were the same person. Otherwise, they wouldn't have listed him under the Barrett name and saying that he was the author of a book, which on the cover he's listed as George Bruce. So anyway, after all the name changing, he died in 1884 at the age of 68 in Baltimore. His obituary lists him as a musician, which makes sense, and the obituary is written for George Barrett. So he stuck with that name from sort of around the end of the Civil War up into the 1880s, it would appear. So what's interesting about the name changing is that the military only seems to have noticed in maybe 2 occasions. Once when he got kicked out of the Dragoons, and once when the author of this article in the 1870s noticed that he went by one name and that he was the same guy that wrote the book under the other name. Although it doesn't really say that in the article. Like I said, the guy must have known, otherwise it wouldn't make any sense. Though what this really says is probably that George had the skills at the drums to where no matter what name and what backstory he came up with when applying to be the drummer or drum major for a regiment, that they believed him. He could back up what he was saying with drumming ability, and thus he could get any position he wanted. So I guess the question as to whether his name was George Bruce or George Barrett and whether he was a deserter kind of was brought up in the 1920s, especially because, like I said, Moeller was a big fan of his. But, drummers in the 1920s who were fans of his didn't seem to care, and not everyone was a fan. Some people were in the Strube camp. Gardner Strube's book, The Drum and Fife Instructor of 1869, was sort of a competing manual, and if you were in the Strube camp, you didn't really care about Bruce anyway, or Barrett, whichever you want to call him. And if you were in the Bruce/Barrett camp, you didn't really care who he was or what his name was because you really liked his work. So you can find snippets of this story in different blogs and websites today. I pieced together a lot of the different Bruces and Barretts throughout this era, based on military documents and other historical records that you can find online. And I think that I've gotten it kind of right. It's a pretty crazy life, though, to keep changing your name, keep changing units. I mean, he lived through the Civil War and probably the Mexican-American War, and it was just a totally crazy time in history, and he had a crazy path through it. But I think it was his drumming skills that really allowed him to just cruise from persona to persona, unit to unit, make up whatever backstory he wanted. So maybe that's a lesson to us. The better at drumming we are, the more we can get away with. I don't know. Just kind of an interesting guy. You know, sometimes you got to remember these people who write these drum books are not just mindless drum machines who come up with rudiment names, but they're real people, and they have some really weird lives sometimes. So that's it for today. Thanks for watching. See you guys next time.